The Story of Civilization, Volume 4, The Age of Faith, Part 2, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 13, Side 1. In those homes and palaces, the arts of the East served the conquerors from the West. The looms of Palermo wove gorgeous stuffs in silk and cloth of gold. The ivory workers made little caskets, shaped and carved in delicate or whimsical designs. The mosaics covered floors, walls, and ceilings with Oriental themes. Greek and Saracen architects and artisans raised churches, monasteries, and palaces whose plan and ornament, showing no trace of Norman styles, gathered up 1,000 years of Byzantine or Arabic influence. In 1143, Greek artists built for Greek nuns, with funds provided by Roger's Admiral George, a convent dedicated to Santa Maria del Ammiraglio, but now known as the Martorana from its founder. It has been so often restored that little remains of its 12th century elements. Typically, an Arabic inscription from a Greek Christian hymn runs round the inner dome. The floors of gleaming varicolored marble, 8 columns of dark porphyry frame 3 apses. Their capitals are most gracefully carved. Walls and spandrels and vaults glitter with golden mosaics, including a famous Christos Pantocrator, the universal king, in the sanctuary cupola. Finer still is the Capella Palatina, the chapel of the palace begun by Roger II in 1132. Here everything is exquisite. The simple design of the marble pavement, the perfection of the slender columns and their diverse capitals, the 282 mosaics filling every tempting space. Above the altar, the solemn figure of Christ in one of the sovereign mosaics of the world, and over all a massive timber ceiling in honeycomb design, carved, gilded, or painted with oriental figures of elephants, antelopes, gazelles, and angels that were probably houris from a Mohammedan's dream of paradise. In all medieval or modern art there is no royal chapel that can compare with this jewel of Norman Sicily. Roger died in 1154, aged 59. His son William I, from 1154 to 1166, earned the title of the Bad, partly because his life was written by his enemies, partly because he let others govern while he lived amid eunuchs and concubines in oriental ease. In his reign, the Moslems of Tunisia rose against the Christians and ended Norman power in Africa. William II, from 1166 to 1189, lived much the same sort of life as the Bad, but was called the Good by amiable biographers, if only to avoid a confusion of names. He asked pardon for his lax morals by financing in 1176 the monastery and cathedral of Monreale, a Mount Royal 5 miles outside of Palermo. The exterior is a disagreeable confusion of shafts and interlacing columns. The cloisters are a work of majestic strength and beauty. The mosaics of the interior are renowned but crude. The capitals, however, are richly carved with realistic life. Noah drunk and sleeping, a swineherd tending a pig, an acrobat standing on his head. Perhaps the oriental morals of the Norman Sicilian kings weakened their constitutions and shortened their line. 40 years after the death of Roger II, his dynasty ingloriously died. William II left no children, and Tancred, illegitimate son of Roger II, was chosen king in 1189. Meanwhile, the German Emperor Henry VI had married Constance, an aunt of William II. Eager to unite all Italy under the imperial crown, he claimed the throne of the Sicilies. He secured the active alliance of Pisa and Genoa, whose commerce was irked by Norman control of the central Mediterranean. In 1194 he appeared before Palermo with irresistible force, persuaded it to open its gates to him, and was there crowned King of Sicily. When he died in 1197, he left his thrones to his 3-year-old son Frederick, who was to become the most powerful and enlightened monarch of a 13th century rich in puissant kings. 2. The Papal States. North of Norman Italy lay the city-state of Benevento, ruled by dukes of Lombard origin. Beyond this were the lands under the immediate temporal power of the popes, the patrimony of Peter, including Anagni, Tivoli, Rome, and thence to Perugia. Rome was the center but hardly the model of Latin Christianity. No city in Christendom had less respect for religion, except as a vested interest. Italy took only a modest part in the Crusades. Venice shared in the fourth only to capture Constantinople. The Italian cities thought of them chiefly as opportunities to establish ports, markets, and trade in the Near East. Frederick II postponed his crusade as long as he could, and embarked upon it with a minimum of religious belief. There were religious souls in Rome, gentle spirits who aided pilgrims to maintain the shrines, but their voices were seldom heard above the din of politics. Aside from the papacy, Rome was in this period a poor city. The Norman sack of 1084 had capped 6 centuries of destruction and neglect. The population had shrunk to some 40,000 from its ancient million. It was not a hub of commerce or industry. While cities of northern Italy led the economic revolution, the papal states tarried in a simple agrarian regime. Market gardens, vineyards, and cattle paddocks mingled with homes and ruins within the walls of Aurelia. The lower classes of the capital lived half by handicraft, half by ecclesiastical charity. The middle classes were a medley of merchants, lawyers, teachers, bankers, students, and resident or visiting priests. The upper classes were the higher clergy and the landed nobility. The old Roman custom of owning in the country and living in the city still prevailed. Long since shorn of any general patriotism that would have united them for national defense, the Roman nobles divided into factions led by rich and powerful families. Frangipani, Orsini, Colonna, Pierleoni, Caetani, Savelli, Corsi, Conti, Annibaldi. Each family made its Roman residence a castle fortress, armed its members and retainers, and frequently indulged in street brawls, occasionally in civil wars. The popes, having only spiritual weapons little feared in Rome, struggled in vain to keep order in the city. They were repeatedly subjected to insult there, sometimes to violence, and many of them, for peace or safety, fled to Anagni, Viterbo, or Perugia, even to Lyon, at last to Avignon. The popes had dreamed of a theocracy in which the word of God, interpreted by the Church, would suffice as law. They found themselves crushed amid the autocracy of the emperors, the oligarchy of the nobles, and the democracy of the citizens. The relics of the Forum and the Capitol kept alive among the Romans the memory of their ancient republic, and periodically an effort was made to restore the old autonomy and forms. The leading nobles were still called senators, though the Senate had disappeared. Consuls were chosen or appointed, though they wielded no power, and some old manuscripts preserved the half-forgotten edicts of Roman law. Inspired by the rise of free cities in northern Italy, the people of Rome in the 12th century began to demand a return to secular self-government. In 1143, they elected a Senate of 56 members, and for some years thereafter elected new senators annually. The mood of the time called for a voice, and found it in Arnold of Brescia. Tradition reports that he had studied under Abélard in France. He returned to Brescia as a monk, practicing such austerities that Bernard described him as a man who neither eats nor drinks. He was substantially orthodox in doctrine, but denied the validity of sacraments administered by priests in a state of sin. He held it immoral for a priest to own property, demanded a return of the clergy to apostolic poverty, and advised the Church to surrender all her material possessions and political power to the state. At the Council of the Lateran in 1139, Innocent II condemned him and commanded him to silence. But Pope Eugenius III absolved him on condition of a pilgrimage to various churches in Rome. It was a kindly error. The sight of the old Republican landmarks fired the imagination of Arnold. Standing amid the ruins, he called upon the Romans to reject clerical rule and to restore the Roman Republic. This in 1145. Fascinated by his fervor, the people chose consuls and tribunes to be actual governors, and established an equestrian order to serve as leaders in a new militia of defense. Intoxicated with the ease of this glorious revolution, the followers of Arnold renounced not only the temporal power of the popes, but the authority in Italy of the German emperors of the Holy Roman Empire. Indeed, they argued, it was the Roman Republic that should rule not Italy alone, but, as of old, the world. They rebuilt and fortified the capital, seized St. Peter's, turned it into a castle, took possession of the Vatican, and levied taxes upon pilgrims. Eugenius III fled to Viterbo and Pisa in 1146, while St. Bernard from Clairvaux hurled denunciations against the people of Rome, and reminded them that their subsistence depended on the presence of the papacy. For 10 years the Comune di Roma ruled the city of the Caesars and the popes. Plucking up his courage, Eugenius III returned to Rome in 1148. He confined himself for a time to spiritual functions, distributed charity, and won the affection of the populace. His second successor, Hadrian IV, shocked by the killing of a cardinal in a public tumult, laid an interdict upon the capital in 1155. Fearful of a profounder revolution than the aristocracy could digest, the Senate abrogated the republic and surrendered to the Pope. Arnold, excommunicated, hid himself in the Campagna. When Frederick Barbarossa approached Rome, Hadrian asked him to arrest the rebel. Arnold was found and apprehended. He was turned over by the emperor to the papal prefect of Rome and was by him hanged in 1155. The corpse was burned, and the ashes were thrown into the Tiber, for fear, said a contemporary, that the people would gather them up and honor them as the ashes of a martyr. His ideas outlived him and reappeared in the Pateran and Waldensian heretics of Lombardy, in the Albigensians of France, in Marsilius of Padua, and in the leaders of the Reformation. The Senate continued to exist till 1216, when Innocent III succeeded in replacing it with 1 or 2 senators congenial to the papal cause. The temporal power of the popes survived till 1870. At different times the papal states included Umbria, with Spoleto and Perugia, the March or frontier land of Ancona on the Adriatic, and the Romagna, or Rome-ruled region, with the cities of Rimini, Imola, Ravenna, Bologna, and Ferrara. Ravenna continued to decline in this period, while Ferrara rose to prominence under the wise leadership of the House of Este. Under the lead of the great lawyers produced by its university, Bologna developed a virile communal life. It was among the first cities to choose a podesta to govern the internal affairs of the commune, and a capitano to lead it in its external relations. Peculiar requirements ruled the choice of the podesta or man of power. He must be a noble, a foreigner to the city, and over 36 years of age. He must own no property within the commune, and must have no relative among the electors. He must not be kin to or come from the same place as the preceding podesta. These strange rules, adopted to secure impartial administration, prevailed in many Italian communes. The captain of the people was chosen not by the communal council, but by the popular party, dominated by the merchant guilds. He represented not the poor, but the business class. In later centuries he would extend his power at the expense of the podesta, as the bourgeoisie would come to surpass the nobility in wealth and influence. 3. Venice triumphant, 1096 to 1311. North of Ferrara and the Po lay the district of Veneto, proud of the cities of Venice, Treviso, Padua, Vicenza, and Verona. It was in this period that Venice matured her power. Her alliance with Byzantium gave her entry to Aegean and Black Sea ports. At Constantinople in the 12th century, her nationals are said to have numbered over 100,000, and to have held a section of the city in terror by their insolence and their brawls. Suddenly the Greek emperor Manuel, prodded by the jealous Genoese, turned against the Venetians in his capital, arrested a great number of them, and ordered a wholesale confiscation of their goods in 1171. Venice declared war. Her people labored night and day to build a fleet, and in 1171 the Doge Vitale Michieli II led 130 ships against Euboea as a first goal of strategy against the straits. But on Euboea's shores his troops fell sick with a disease said to have been caused by Greeks poisoning the water supply. So many thousands died that the ships could not be manned for war. The Doge led his armada back to Venice, where the plague infected and decimated the inhabitants, and at a meeting of the assembly the Doge, blamed for these misfortunes, was stabbed to death, this in 1172. It is against the background of these events that we must view the Fourth Crusade and the oligarchic revolution that transformed the constitution of Venice. The great merchants, fearing the collapse of their commercial empire if such defeats continued, resolved to take the election of the Doge and the determination of public policy from the General Assembly and establish a more select council which should be better fitted to consider and transact affairs of state and might serve as a check upon both the passions of the people and the autocracy of the Doge. The three highest judges of the Republic were persuaded to appoint a commission to draw up a new constitution. Its report recommended that each of the 6 wards of the city-state should choose 2 leading men, each of whom should choose 40 able men. The 480 deputies, so chosen, were to form the Major Concilio, or Greater Council, as the general legislature of the nation. The Greater Council, in turn, was to choose 60 of its members as a Senate to govern commerce, finance, and foreign relations. The Arengo, or Popular Assembly, was to meet only to ratify or reject proposals of war or peace. A Privy Council of 6 men, elected severally from the 6 wards, was to govern the state in any interregnum, and its sanction was to be required to legalize any governmental action of a doge. The first Greater Council elected by this procedure chose 34 of its members, who chose 11 of their number, who then, in public deliberation in the Cathedral of San Marco, chose the doge, this in 1173. A cry of protest arose from the people at losing their right of naming the head of the state, but the new doge diverted the disturbance by scattering coin among the crowd. In 1192, on the election of Enrico Dandolo, the Greater Council required the doge to swear in his coronation oath to obey all the laws of the state. The mercantile oligarchy was now supreme. Dandolo, already 84, proved to be one of the strongest leaders in Venetian history. Through his Machiavellian diplomacy and personal heroism, Venice avenged the disaster of 1171 by capturing and despoiling Constantinople in 1204. Thereby Venice became the dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean and the Black Sea, and the commercial leadership of Europe passed from Byzantium to Italy. In 1261, the Genoese aided the Greeks to regain Constantinople and were rewarded with commercial preference there. But 3 years later, the Venetian fleet defeated the Genoese near Sicily, and the Greek emperor was forced to restore the favored position of Venice in his capital. The triumphant oligarchy capped these external victories with another constitutional stroke. In 1297, the Doge Pietro Gradenigo pushed through the council a proposal that only those citizens and their male posterity should be eligible to the council who had sat in it since 1293. The great majority of the people were excluded from office by this closing of the council. A closed caste was created. A libro d'oro, or golden book of marriages and births within this patrician caste, was kept to ensure purity of blood and monopoly of power. The mercantile oligarchy decreed itself an aristocracy of birth. When the people planned to revolt against the new constitution, their leaders were admitted into the hall of the council and were immediately hanged in 1300. It must be admitted that this frank and ruthless oligarchy governed well. Public order was better maintained, public policy more shrewdly guided, laws more stable and effective than in the other communities of medieval Italy. Venetian laws for the regulation of physicians and apothecaries preceded similar statutes of Florence by half a century. In 1301, laws forbade unhealthy industries in residential quarters and excluded from Venice industries that poured injurious fumes into the air. Navigation laws were rigorous and detailed. All imports and exports were subject to state supervision and control. Diplomatic reports covered trade more than politics, and economic statistics were here for the first time made a part of government. Agriculture was almost unknown in Venice, but handicrafts were highly developed, for Venice had imported from the old cities of the eastern Mediterranean arts and crafts half submerged by political upheavals in the west. Venetian products in iron, brass, glass, gold cloth, and silk were renowned in 3 continents. The building of boats for pleasure, commerce, or war was probably the greatest of Venetian industries. It reached a capitalistic stage of mass labor and corporate finance, and almost a socialistic stage through control by its chief client, the state. Picturesque galleys with lofty prows, painted sails, and as many as 180 oars bound Venice with Constantinople, Tyre, Alexandria, Lisbon, London, and a score of other cities in a golden chain of ports and trade. Goods from the valley of the Po came to Venice to be reshipped. The products of the Rhine cities came over the Alps to spread out from her quays to the Mediterranean world. The Rialto became the busiest thoroughfare in Europe, crowded with merchants, sailors, and bankers from 100 lands. The wealth of the north could not compare with the opulence of a city where everything was geared to commerce and finance, and where one ship sent to Alexandria and back brought 1,000% on the investment, if it encountered no enemy, pirate, or destructive storm. In the 13th century, Venice was the richest city in Europe, equaled perhaps only by those Chinese cities that her Marco Polo incredibly described. Faith declines as wealth increases. The Venetians made much use of religion in government and consoled the voteless with processions and paradise, but the ruling classes rarely allowed Christianity or excommunication to interfere with business or war. Siamo Veneziani, poi Cristiani, ran their motto. We are Venetians, after that we are Christians. Ecclesiastics were excluded from any share in the government. Venetian merchants sold arms and slaves and sometimes gave military intelligence to Muslims at war with Christians. A certain liberality went with this broad-minded venality. Muslims might come safely to Venice, and Jews, especially in the Giudecca on the island of Spinalunga, might worship peacefully in their synagogues. Dante denounced the unbridled lasciviousness of the Venetians, but we must not trust the strictures of one who cursed so ecumenically. More significant are the severe penalties prescribed in Venetian law for parents who prostituted their children, or the vainly repeated laws to check electoral corruption. The impression we get is of a hard and brilliant aristocracy stoically resigned to the poverty of the masses, and a populace solacing poverty with the uncornered joys of love. As early as 1094 we hear of the Carnival. In 1228, the first mention of masks. In 1296, the Senate made the last day before Lent, the French Mardi Gras, a public holiday. On such occasions, both sexes flaunted their most expensive finery. Rich ladies crowned themselves with jeweled tiaras or hoods, or turbans woven with cloth of gold. Their eyes gleamed through veils of gold or silver web, their necks held strings of pearls, their hands were gloved with chamois or silk. Their feet were shod with sandals or shoes of leather, wood, or cork, embroidered in red and gold. Their gowns were of fine linen, silk, or brocade, sprinkled with gems and cut low in the neck to the scandal and fascination of their times. They wore false hair, they painted and powdered, they laced and fasted to be slim. They moved freely in public at any time, joined with shy allure in pleasure parties and gondola escapades, and listened willingly to troubadours importing Provence modes of song for the eternal themes of love. The Venetians did not in this period go in for culture. They had a good public library, but seemed to have made little use of it. No contributions to learning, no lasting poetry appeared amid this unrivaled wealth. Schools were numerous in the 13th century, and we hear of private and state scholarships for poor students. But as late as the 14th century there were Venetian judges who could not read. Music was held in high esteem. Art was not yet the superb coloratura of later days, but wealth was bringing to Venice the art of many lands, taste was growing, the foundation was being laid, and old Roman skills survived, above all in glass. We must not picture the Venice of that age as quite so lovely as Wagner or Nietzsche found it in the 19th century. Houses were of wood and streets were simple earth. The Piazza di San Marco, however, was paved with brick in 1172, and the pigeons were there as early as 1256. Pretty bridges began to curve over the canals, and over the Grand Canal the traghetti already ferried many passengers. The side canals were probably less malodorous then than now, for time is needed for any full ripening. But no faults of street or stream could close the soul to the grandeur of a city lifting itself up, century by century, out of the marshes and mists of the lagoons, or the wonder of a people rising out of desolation and isolation to cover the sea with its ships and levy tribute of wealth and beauty upon half the world. Between Venice and the Alps lay the city and March of Treviso, of which we shall note only that its people so loved life that it won the name of Marca Amorosa or Gioiosa. In 1214, we are told, the city celebrated the festival of the Castello d'Amore. A wooden castle was set up, and hung with carpets, drapes, and garlands. Pretty Trevisan women held it, armed with scented water, fruit, and flowers. Youthful cavaliers from Venice competed with gay blades from Padua in besieging the ladies, bombarding them with like weapons. The Venetians, they say, won the day by mingling ducats with their flowers. In any case, the castle and its fair defenders fell. 4. From Mantua to Genoa. West of the Veneto, the famous cities of Lombardy ruled the plains between the Po and the Alps. Mantua, Cremona, Brescia, Bergamo, Como, Milan, Pavia. South of the Po, in what is now Emilia, were Modena, Reggio, Parma, Piacenza. Lovers of Italy will not resent these sonorous litanies. Between Lombardy and France, the province of Piedmont enclosed Vercelli and Turin. And south of these, Liguria bent around the Gulf and city of Genoa. The wealth of the region was the gift of the Po, which crossed the peninsula from west to east, carrying the commerce, filling the canals, watering the fields. The growth of industry and trade gave these cities the wealth and pride that enabled them generally to ignore their nominal sovereign, the German emperor, and to subdue the semi-feudal lords of their hinterland. Usually a cathedral stood at the center of these Italian towns to brighten life with the drama of devotion and the spur of hope. Near it, a baptistry to mark the entry of the child into the privileges and responsibilities of Christian citizenship, and a campanile to sound the call to worship, assembly, or arms. In the neighboring piazza, or public square, peasants and craftsmen offered their products. Actors, acrobats, and minstrels performed. Heralds cried their proclamations. Citizens chatted after Sunday Mass, and youths or knights engaged in sports or tournaments. A town hall, some shops, some houses or tenements helped to form a guard of brick around the square. From this center ran the crooked, winding, climbing streets, so narrow that when a cart or horseman passed, the pedestrians dodged into a doorway or flattened themselves against a wall. As the 13th century progressed and wealth grew, the stucco houses were roofed with red tiles, making a picturesque pattern for those who could forget the odors and the mud. Only a few streets in the central square were paved. Around the city ran a towered and battlemented wall, for war was frequent, and a man had to know how to fight if he cared to be other than a monk. The greatest of these cities were Genoa and Milan. Genoa, La Superba, its lovers called it, was perfectly placed for business and pleasure, rising on a hill before a sea that invited commerce, and sharing in the warm climate of a Riviera that reached out to Rapallo on the east and San Remo on the west. Already a busy port in Roman days, Genoa developed a population of merchants, manufacturers, bankers, shipwrights, sailors, soldiers, and politicians. Genoese engineers brought in clear water from the Ligurian Alps by an aqueduct worthy of ancient Rome, and raised a gigantic mole out of the bay to give her great harbor security in storm and war. Like the Venetians of this epoch, the Genoese cared little for letters or art. They spent themselves in conquering competitors and exploring new avenues for gain. The Bank of Genoa was almost the state. It lent money to the city on condition of collecting the municipal revenue. Through this power, it dominated the government, and every party that came into office had to pledge loyalty to the bank. But the Genoese were as brave as they were acquisitive. They cooperated with Pisa to sweep the Saracens from the western Mediterranean from 1015 to 1113, and then fought Pisa intermittently until they shattered their rivals' power in the naval battle of Meloria in 1284. For that last conflict, Pisa called all men between the ages of 20 and 60, Genoa all between 18 and 70. We may judge from this the spirit and passion of the age. As there is a natural loathing between men and serpents, wrote the monk Salimbene, so there is between the Pisans and the Genoese, between the Pisans and the men of Lucca. In that engagement off the coast of Corsica, the men fought hand to hand until half the combatants were dead. And there was such wailing in Genoa and Pisa as was never heard in those cities from their foundation to our times. Learning of this disaster to Pisa, the good men of Lucca and Florence thought it an excellent time to send an expedition against that unfortunate city. But Pope Martin IV commanded them to stay their hands. Meanwhile, the Genoese pushed into the east and came into competition with the Venetians, and between these two rose the bitterest hatred of all. In 1255 they contested the possession of Acre. The Hospitallers fought on the side of Genoa, the Templars for Venice. In that battle alone, 20,000 men fell. It destroyed Christian unity in Syria, and perhaps decided the failure of the Crusades. The struggle between Genoa and Venice continued till 1379, when the Genoese suffered at Chioggia the same culminating defeat that they had inflicted upon the Pisans a century before. Of the Lombard cities, Milan was the richest and most powerful. Once a Roman capital, she was proud of her age and her traditions. The consuls of her republic defied the emperors, her bishops defied the popes, her people shared or sheltered heresies that challenged Christianity itself. In the 13th century she had 200,000 inhabitants, 13,000 houses, 1,000 taverns. Herself loving liberty, she did not willingly concede it to others. She patrolled the roads with her troops to force caravans, whithersoever bound, to go to Milan first. She ruined Como and Lodi, and struggled to subjugate Pisa, Cremona, and Pavia. She could not rest until she controlled all the commerce of the Po. At the Diet of Constance in 1154, 2 citizens of Lodi appeared before Frederick Barbarossa and implored his protection for their town. The emperor warned Milan to desist from her attempts upon Lodi. His message was rejected with scorn and trampled underfoot. Frederick, eager to subdue Lombardy to imperial obedience, seized the opportunity to destroy Milan in 1162. 5 years later, her survivors and friends had rebuilt the city, and all Lombardy rejoiced in her resurrection as a symbol of Italy's resolve never to be ruled by a German king. Frederick yielded, but before he died he married his son Henry VI to Constance, daughter of Roger II of Sicily. In Henry's son, the Lombard League would find a more terrible Frederick. 5. Frederick II, 1194 to 1250. 1. The excommunicate crusader. Constance was 30 when she married Henry, 42 when she gave birth to her only child. Fearing doubts of her pregnancy and of her child's legitimacy, she had a tent erected in the marketplace of Iesi, near Ancona, and there, in the sight of all, she was delivered of the boy who was to become the most fascinating figure of the culminating medieval century. In his veins, the blood of the Norman kings of Italy merged with the blood of the Hohenstaufen emperors of Germany. He was 4 when at Palermo he was crowned king of Sicily in 1198. His father had died a year earlier. His mother died a year afterward. Her will besought Pope Innocent III to undertake the guardianship, education, and political protection of her son, and offered him in return a handsome stipend and the regency and renewed suzerainty of Sicily. He accepted gladly, and used his position to end that union of Sicily with Germany, which Frederick's father had just achieved. The popes reasonably dreaded an empire that should encompass the papal states on every side, and in effect imprison and dominate the papacy. Innocent provided for Frederick's education, but supported Otto IV for the German throne. Frederick grew up in neglect, sometimes in poverty, so that compassionate citizens of Palermo had on occasion to bring the royal gammon food. He was allowed to run free in the streets and markets of the polyglot capital, and to pick his associates wherever he pleased. He received no systematic education, but his avid mind learned from all that he heard or saw. The world would later marvel at the scope and detail of his knowledge. In those days and ways he acquired Arabic and Greek, and some of the lore of the Jews. He grew familiar with different peoples, garbs, customs, and faiths, and never quite lost his youthful habit of tolerance. He read many volumes of history. He became a good rider and fencer, and a lover of horses and hunting. He was short but strong, with a fair and gracious countenance and long red curly hair, clever, positive, and proud. At 12 he dismissed Innocent's deputy regent and took over the government. At 14 he came of age. At 15 he married Constance of Aragon and set out to reclaim the imperial crown. Fortune favored him, for a price. Otto IV had violated his agreement to respect the sovereignty of the Pope in the Papal States. Innocent excommunicated him, and ordered the barons and bishops of the empire to elect as emperor his young ward Frederick, as old in wisdom as he is young in years. But Innocent, so suddenly turning toward Frederick, did not veer from his purpose of protecting the papacy. As the price of his support, he required from Frederick in 1212 a pledge to continue tribute and fealty from Sicily to the popes, to guard the inviolability of the Papal States, to keep the 2 Sicilies, Norman southern Italy and the island, perpetually separate from the empire, to reside in Germany as emperor and leave the Sicilies to his infant son Henry as king of Sicily, under a regent to be appointed by Innocent. Furthermore, Frederick bound himself to maintain all the powers of the clergy in his realm, to punish heretics, and to take the cross as a crusader. Financing his trip and retinue with money provided by the Pope, Frederick entered a Germany still held by Otto's armies. But Otto was defeated by Philip Augustus at Bouvines. His resistance collapsed, and Frederick was crowned emperor in a splendid ceremony at Aachen in 1215. There he solemnly renewed his pledge to undertake a crusade, and in the full enthusiasm of triumphant youth he won many princes to make the same vow. For a moment he seemed to Germany a God-sent David who would free David's Jerusalem from the heirs of Saladin. But delays ensued. Otto's brother Henry raised an army to depose Frederick, and the new pope, Honorius III, agreed that the young emperor must defend his throne. Frederick overcame Henry, but meanwhile he became involved in imperial politics. Apparently he already longed for his native Italy. The heat and blood of the South were in his temperament, and Germany irked him. Of his 56 years, only 8 were spent there. He granted large feudal powers to the barons, gave charters of self-government to several cities, and entrusted the government of Germany to Archbishop Engelbert of Cologne and Hermann of Salza, the able Grand Master of the Teutonic Knights. Despite Frederick's apparent negligence, Germany enjoyed prosperity and peace during the 35 years of his reign. The barons and bishops were so satisfied with their absentee landlord that to please him they crowned his 7-year-old son Henry King of the Romans, that is, heir to the imperial throne, in 1220. At the same time, Frederick appointed himself regent of Sicily for Henry, who remained in Germany. This rather inverted the plans of Innocent, but Innocent was dead. Honorius yielded and even crowned Frederick emperor at Rome, for he was anxious that Frederick should embark at once to rescue the Crusaders in Egypt. However, the barons in southern Italy and the Saracens in Sicily staged a revolt. Frederick argued that he must restore order in his Italian realm before venturing on a long absence. Meanwhile, in 1222, his wife died. Hoping to prod him to fulfill his vow, Honorius persuaded him to marry Isabella, heiress to the lost kingdom of Jerusalem. Frederick complied in 1225 and added the title of King of Jerusalem to those of King of Sicily and Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Trouble with the Lombard cities again delayed him. In 1227, Honorius died, and the stern Gregory IX ascended the papal throne. Frederick now prepared in earnest, built a great fleet, and gathered 40,000 crusaders at Brindisi. There a terrible plague broke out in his army. Thousands died, more thousands deserted. The emperor himself and his chief lieutenant, Louis of Thuringia, caught the infection. Nevertheless, Frederick gave the order to sail. Louis died, and Frederick grew worse. His doctors and the higher clergy who were with him advised him to return to Italy. He did, and sought a cure at Pozzuoli. Pope Gregory, his patience exhausted, refused to hear the explanations of Frederick's emissaries, and announced to the world the excommunication of the emperor. 7 months later, still excommunicate, Frederick set sail for Palestine, this in 1228. On learning of his arrival in Syria, Gregory absolved the subjects of Frederick and his son Henry from their oaths of allegiance, and began negotiations to depose the emperor. Taking these actions as a declaration of war, Frederick's regent in Italy invaded the Papal States. Gregory retaliated by sending an army to invade Sicily. Monks spread a rumor that Frederick was dead, and soon a large part of Sicily and southern Italy were in papal hands. 2 Franciscan delegates of the Pope reached Acre soon after Frederick, and forbade any man in the Christian ranks to obey the excommunicate. The Saracen commander, Al-Kamil, astonished to find a European ruler who understood Arabic and appreciated Arabic literature, science, and philosophy, made a favorable peace with Frederick, who now entered Jerusalem as a bloodless conqueror. As no clergyman would crown him King of Jerusalem, he crowned himself in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The Bishop of Caesarea, calling the shrine and city desecrated by Frederick's presence, laid an interdict upon religious services in Jerusalem and Acre. Some Knights Templar, learning that Frederick planned to visit the reputed site of Christ's baptism in the Jordan, sent secret word to Al-Kamil, suggesting that here was a chance for the Sultan to capture the emperor. The Moslem commander sent the letter to Frederick. To free Jerusalem from its interdict, the emperor left it on the 3rd day and went to Acre. There, as he walked to his ship, the Christian populace bombarded him with filth. Arriving at Brindisi, Frederick organized an impromptu army and advanced to recapture the towns that had yielded to the Pope. The papal army fled, the cities opened their gates. Only Sora resisted and stood siege. It was captured and reduced to ashes. At the frontier of the Papal States, Frederick stopped and sent the Pope a plea for peace. The Pope agreed. The Treaty of San Germano was signed in 1230, The excommunication was withdrawn. For a moment there was peace. 2. The Wonder of the World. Frederick turned to administration, and from his court at Foggia, in Apulia, wrestled with the problems of too wide a realm. He visited Germany in 1231 and confirmed, in a statute in favor of princes, the powers and privileges that he and his son had extended to the barons. He was willing to surrender Germany to feudalism if that would leave him at peace to develop his ideas in Italy. Perhaps he recognized that the Battle of Bouvines had ended German hegemony in Europe, and that the 13th century belonged to France and Italy. He paid for his neglect of Germany in the rebellion and suicide of his son. Out of the polyglot passions of Sicily, his despotic hand forged an order and prosperity recalling the brilliance of Roger II's reign. The rebellious Saracens of the hills were captured, were transported to Italy, were trained as mercenaries, and became the most reliable soldiers in Frederick's army. We may imagine the wrath of the popes at the sight of Moslem warriors led by a Christian emperor against papal troops. Palermo remained in law the capital of the Regno, as the two Sicilies were briefly called. But the real capital was Foggia. Frederick loved Italy more ardently than most Italians. He marveled that Yahweh had made so much of Palestine when Italy existed. He called his southern kingdom the apple of his eye, a haven amidst the floods, a pleasure garden amidst a wilderness of thorns. In 1223 he began to build at Foggia the rambling castle palace of which only a gateway remains today. Soon a city of palaces rose about his own to house his aides. He invited the nobles of his Italian realm to serve as pages at his court. There they rose through widening functions to administer the government. Head of them all was Piero della Vigne, a graduate of the School of Law at Bologna. Frederick made him logothete, or Secretary of State, and loved him as a brother or son. At Foggia, as at Paris 70 years later, lawyers replaced the clergy in administration. Here, in the state nearest to the See of Peter, the secularization of government was complete. Reared in an age of chaos and learned in Oriental ideas, Frederick never dreamed that the order called a state could be maintained except by monarchical force. He seems honestly to have believed that without a strong central power men would destroy or repeatedly impoverish themselves through crime, ignorance, and war. Like Barbarossa, he valued social order more highly than popular liberty, and felt that the ruler who competently maintains order earns all the luxuries of his keep. He allowed some measure of public representation in his government. Twice a year, at 5 points in the Regno, assemblies met to deal with local problems, complaints, and crimes. To these assemblies he summoned not only the nobles and prelates of the district, but 4 deputies from each major city, and 2 from each town. For the rest, Frederick was an absolute monarch. He accepted as axiomatic the basic principle of Roman civil law, that the citizens had handed over to the emperor the sole right to legislate. At Melfi in 1231 he issued for the Regno, chiefly through the legal skill and counsel of Piero della Vigne, the Liber Augustalis, the first scientifically codified system of laws since Justinian, and one of the most complete bodies of jurisprudence in legal history. It was in some ways a reactionary code. It accepted all the class distinctions of feudalism, and maintained old rights of the lord over the serf. In many ways it was a progressive code. It deprived the nobles of legislative, judicial, and minting powers, centering these in the state. It abolished trial by combat or ordeal. It provided for state prosecutors to pursue crimes that heretofore had gone unpunished if no citizen brought in a complaint. It condemned the law's delays, advised judges to cut down the perorations of advocates, and required the state courts to sit daily except on holidays. Like most medieval rulers, Frederick carefully regulated the national economy. A just price was established for various services and goods. The state nationalized the production of salt, iron, steel, hemp, tar, dyed fabrics, and silks. It operated textile factories with Saracen slave women workers and eunuch foremen. It owned and operated slaughterhouses and public baths. It created model farms, fostered the cultivation of cotton and sugar cane, cleared woods and fields of injurious animals, built roads and bridges, and sank wells to augment the water supply. Foreign trade was largely managed by the state and was carried in vessels owned by the government. One of these had a crew of 300 men. Internal traffic tolls were reduced to a minimum, but tariffs on exports and imports provided the chief revenues of the state. There were many other taxes, for this government, like all others, could always find uses for money. To Frederick's credit must be put a sound and conscientious currency. To make this monolithic state majestic and holy without relying upon a Christianity normally hostile to him, Frederick strove to restore in his own person all the awe and splendor that had hedged a Roman emperor. This book is concluded on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.